All right, here's a preview of what we're going to build. We're going to build this card component, and we're going to put this on this light gray background. So I've cleaned up the code in app component. Here we have a view that acts as a container for our cards. This is just a temporary solution. In the next section, we're going to build the screen to display the listings. So here we have a view. Let's give it a bunch of styles. First, I'm going to set the background color to F8, F4, F4. Again, this is a temporary solution. So I don't want to add this color to our palette and then import the palette here because we're going to throw away all this code. This container is purely to test our card component, okay? Now, let's set a padding of 20. So we have some space between the edges of the screen and our cards. I also want to add some extra padding on the top. Let's say 100 pixels, so we don't have to worry about this notch on iPhone. Now, inside this container, we're going to have a card component like this. Our card component needs 3 props. Title, which we set to something like red jacket for sale. The second prop is subtitle, which we set to the price. Now, why didn't I call this price? Because I want this card component to be reusable. I don't want it to be tied to the context of listings. Maybe somewhere else, we want to reuse this component in a different context. So here we have generic props like title and subtitle. And finally, we need another prop like image. And here we specified the path to our image. So we go to app/assets and load jacket.jpg. So this is the basic idea. Now let's go ahead and implement this component. So here in the components folder, let's add a new file, card.js. Here we're going to implement a function component. Now in this component, we're going to have a view as a container. That is our card here. Inside this container, we're going to have 3 components, an image and 2 text components. So let's delete this div and render a view. Now we need to apply a few styles here. So let's import the style sheet module and then use it over here. Now, let's define the styles for our card. What styles do we need here? Well, our cards have these round corners. So we need to apply a border radius of, let's say, 15 pixels. What else do we need here? Our cards should have a white background because we're putting them on this light gray background. So we need this white background on the card so they stand out. So we set background color to white, or we can use the white color in our color palette. That is better. So on the top, we import colors from, we go one level up, then we go to config and load the colors module. Now over here, we set background color to colors.white. That's better. What else do we need here? We need to add some margin below each card so cards are not so close to each other. So here we set margin bottom to 20. Now let's apply these styles. So here's our container. We set style to styles.card. Now in this container, we need 3 components, an image and 2 text components. So let's add the image. Here we set its source to, this is where we use the require function to load our image. So I'm going to destructure this props argument. What props we need here? We need title, subtitle, and image. So we pass the image here to load our image. And below that, we're going to have 2 text components. Here I'm going to use our app text component. VS Code is not picking that up, so we have to manually import it on the top. So import app text from current folder app text. Good. So here's our app text. Now, here we render the title. Let's duplicate this line and render the subtitle. Good. Now, before going any further, let's test our application up to this point. So save the changes. Now we go to app.js. We have used our card component, but we didn't import it on the top. So let's import card from, we go to app/components/card. Good. So This is not my simulator. This is just an image preview. Let's put it aside. Here's my simulator. We have this error, transform error. This happened in card.js, and the actual error is invalid call at line 10. So here's our card component, and this is line 10. The reason this is happening is that we're trying to load an image dynamically. So we're requiring this image, and at the time of writing this code, it's not clear what this image is. So React Native Packager cannot determine the name of the image or the asset it should include in our bundle. To solve this problem, we need to use the require function here in app.js, where we specify the path to our image. So let's wrap this with braces, and here we call require. Again, this is a temporary solution. In the future, when we connect our app to a backend, we're not going to use the require function. We're just going to pass the URL of our image. Okay? So save the changes. Now back to our card. Let's set the source to our image. Now let's reload. Okay, we get something, but this image is so big, that is why it's not fitting on the screen. So here we need to apply a few styles. So let's set the style to styles.image. Now over here, we define our image styles. So I'm going to set the width to 100% and height to 200 pixels. That's better. Now, here we need some padding around these two text components. So I'm going to add them inside a container and apply padding there. That is super easy. So let's add a container view. We set the style to styles.details container, and then move these two lines there. So I'm holding down Alt and press up. Very easy. Now let's define this object. So details container. Here I'm going to apply a padding of 20 pixels. Save. That is better. Next, we need to add some space below our title. Currently, it's so close to the subtitle. So here's the title. Let's set the style to styles.title and then implement it here. Again, I'm trying to sort this alphabetically. You don't have to, but this is what I'm trying to do. So here we set margin bottom to, let's say, 7 pixels. Now nothing happens because this app text component we have built doesn't support extra styles. To solve this problem, we go to app text. Now here, we read the style prop and then apply it here dynamically. So currently we're setting style to this object, styles.text. Here we're going to pass an array. The first object in this array is styles.text. And the second object is the style object that we read from the prop. Okay, so save. Now we have some margin below our title. Beautiful. So next, we go back to our card and apply some style to our subtitle. We want to make it green and bold. So that is super easy. We set style to styles.subtitle and then implement it over here. So subtitle is an object with two properties. First, we set the color to colors.secondary. That is our green color. And then we set font weight to bold. That looks pretty good. We have a tiny problem here. Let me zoom in so you can see clearly. Look at the top edges of our image. Top left and top right. We don't have round corners here. Do you see? The reason this is happening is because we have overflowing. So if we didn't have this image, here we would have a round corner like this, right? Now our image is exceeding that round corner. So we have overflow. We have extra content. So to solve this problem, we need to go to our container. That is the card container here. Here's the card container. And set overflow to hidden. So if we have overflow, it should be hidden. Save the changes. Now we have these beautiful round corners. So we're almost done. I'm happy with this for now. Let's see what it looks like on Android. Here it is. It looks pretty decent. So we're done with this. Let's move on to the next video. Now we're ready to build the listing detail screen. This screen is very simple and it's actually very similar to our card component. Let me show you. So here in the screens folder, let's add a new file. called listing details screen.js. Here we're going to implement a function component. Now, in this component, first we're going to add a view. This is a container for all our components. In this container, we're going to have an image and a couple of text components. So let's add an image. Next, we set its source to. We use the require function. Now, because we are in the screens folder, we have to go one level up, and then we go to assets and load jacket.jpg. So for now, I want to hard code all these values. I don't want to pass them as props or navigation parameters. I just want to build the layout with some pretty styles. So here's our image. Now, let's apply a bunch of styles to this image. So we import style sheet on the top, and then use it over here. So let's define the styles for our image. What do we need here? I'm going to set the width to 100% and the height to 300 pixels. Next, let's set the style here to styles.image. Now let's test our implementation up to this point. Always try to write a bit of code and test it. It's much easier than spending 20 minutes on a big complex screen and then facing all sorts of errors along the way. So save the changes. Now we go to app.js. Let's delete all the code here. This is why I told you this is a temporary solution. So here we're going to render listing details screen. All right. Our screen is working well. Beautiful. So below this image, let's add the title and the price for this listing. So that is super easy. We use our app text component and set the title to red jacket for sale. Let's add another app text and set the price to $100. Here's what we get. We need to put this inside a container and add some padding in that container, exactly like what we did in our cart component. So let's add a container and then move these two components over here. Next, we set the style to styles.details container. So I'm following the same naming that I used in my cart component. This makes it easier to maintain this application. Now, let's implement the styles. So details container is an object with padding of 20 pixels. Looks good. Now let's apply some styles to our title. So let's set the style to styles.title and then implement it here. So title is an object. Let's set the font to 24 pixels. That's good. I also like to make it a bit thicker, so font weight to 500. Nice. Now let's apply some styles to the price. So here we set style to styles.price. Now in this context, I'm using a very specific name like price as opposed to subtitle because this is not a reusable component. This is an entire screen. We're not going to reuse this somewhere else, okay? So let's stick with this name, price, and then define those styles here. I'm going to set the color to the secondary color. So let's import our color palette. Import colors from, we go one level up, then config, and then colors. Now, we set the color to colors.secondary. I also like to make this bold and set the font size to 20 pixels. Okay, that looks good to me. We just need some vertical margin here because the title and the price are so close. So let's set margin vertical to 10. That looks good to me. We're almost done here. Below these details, we need to show who has posted this listing. We're going to implement that next. Now we're going to take our listing details screen to the next level by showing information about the person who posted the listing. So we're going to have this structure, an image, and a couple of text components. This structure is a very common structure. It's something we see in various apps all the time. So we can implement it as a reusable component and then use it like this. So here on listing details screen, right after the price, we can use this component. Let's call it list item. So I'm using a generic name because this has nothing to do with the context of this app. We can use this component in various contexts, okay? So this component should have 3 props, an image. We set this to the path to our image. So we go 1 level up, and then we go to assets, and then load my image, or you can use your own. And just like before, here we have to call the require function. So let's wrap this in braces and then call the require function. Next, we specify a title. So we can set this to my name or yours. And then a subtitle. Again, I'm using a generic name. So we set this to 5 listings. So this is the subtitle, okay? Now let's go ahead and implement this component. So here in the components folder, let's add a new file called listitem.js. We're going to implement a function component. Right here, I'm going to destructure this props argument. So we're going to pick the title, the subtitle, and the image. Now, let's add a view. This is going to be our main container. Now, we have to set the flex direction on this container to row because we want to lay these horizontally. First, we want to add the image, and then we want to add the title and subtitle. So let's import the style sheet module on the top and then use it over here. So here we're going to define the styles for our container. For now, we just need to set flex direction to row and then use the style over here. So style equals styles.container. Now in this container, we're going to have an image. Let's set its source to the image argument that we have over here. We should also apply a bunch of styles to this image. So let's do that right here. Styles.image. And then implement them here. What styles do we need for this image? We need to set its width to 70, the height to 70 as well. With this, we get a square. Now to make it round, we have to apply a border radius that is at least half the size of the image. So we set border radius to 35. And also, I would like to add a right margin so we have some space between the image and these other details. So let's set margin right to 10. Okay, so in this container, we have an image, and then we're going to have another container. In this container, we're going to have the title and the subtitle. Now, the reason I'm adding this container is that by default, all containers, their flex direction is set to column. So here we set the flex direction to row, so we can lay out our components horizontally, and then we add a second container so we can lay them out vertically, okay? Now in this component, we're going to have 2 text components. So we import app text and render the title. Let's duplicate this and render the subtitle as well. Now, before going any further, let's test our implementation. So save the changes and save the changes here as well. This is just an image preview. It's not my iOS simulator. Let's put it aside. So we get this error because we didn't import the list item component. So here in listing details screen, we need to import list item from, we go 1 level up, then we go to components and load list item. Okay, so here's what we get. It's not bad. There are a few things I want to improve here. First, I want to make the title a little bit thicker. So let's do that straight away. Here's the title. Let's give it a style. So we set this to styles, the title. And then we implement it here. So for the title, I'm going to set the font weight to 400. Save. I don't see much changes. Let's set it to 500. That is better. Now for the subtitle, I'm going to use a medium gray so it gets separated from the title. So let's set the style to styles, subtitle, and then we implement it over here. Super easy. Subtitle is an object with what property? We're going to set the color to 6E6969. Okay, look. Now the subtitle gets separated from the title. That is better. But we don't want to hard-code this value here. We want to put it in our color palette. So let's go to colors.js and define a new property called medium and set it to 6E6969. And then back to our list item. Let's import our color palette. So import colors from config/colors. And then down the bottom, we're going to replace this hard-coded value with colors.medium. Good. We're almost done. The last thing I want to add is some vertical space between these details and the owner of this listing. Now, where is the right place to implement this? Well, I don't want to implement this in our list item because this may not work somewhere else where we use this component. We want this component to be reusable, right? So this is something specific to this screen. So let's go back to listing detail screen. This is where we are using our list item component. So I'm going to wrap this inside a container. Let's move it over here. And then apply a style here. So styles.userContainer. Now let's implement user container. This is where we add margin vertical of, let's say, 50 pixels. Looks pretty good to me. Let's try 40. I think that's better. All right, the last thing we want to do in this section is to improve the view image screen. So I've modified our app component. Here we're rendering the view image screen. We want to replace these placeholders with icons. So let's go to view image screen. On the top, we're going to import material community icons. So import from @expo/vector icons. We're going to import material community icons. Now here's the placeholder for the close icon. Let's take a quick look at the styles we have defined. So here's the styles for the close icon. We no longer need the width, the height, and the background color. So let's delete these. We only need the position to be absolute and top and left properties. So we have the icon over here. Now let's put the icon inside this container. So material community icon. The name of this icon is going to be close. Save the changes. We don't see it because by default it's black. So let's change the color to white. Here it is. Now let's make it bigger. So I'm going to set it to 30 pixels. I think that looks good. Now here we can also use the white color in our palette, but it's not a big deal. So I'm going to leave it. I don't want to repeat the same thing over and over to waste your time. So here's our first icon. Now for the delete icon, once again, let's delete the styles we no longer need. So try to keep your code as lean as possible. Now let's add the delete icon. So I'm going to copy this line, paste it over here, and then change the name of the icon to trash can outline. Save. So here's our icon. I prefer to make them a little bit bigger. So what about 35? Okay, that looks pretty good. So we're done with this section, and I will see you in the next section. Almost every app needs to present a list of data. So in this section, you will learn how to build lists with React Native. As part of this section, we'll be taking our app to the next level. We'll build 3 new screens, as well as a bunch of reusable components along the way. So let's jump in and get started. So we're going to start building the messages screen. And as part of this, we're going to use the flatlist component to render a list of items. As you can see here on the official documentation, flatlist is fully cross-platform and it has many features. It has support for header, footer, separator, pull to refresh, scroll loading, and so on. So back to our code, let's add a new screen. We're going to call this messages screen. Now let's create a function component. Now here we want to render a flat list. So let's import flat list. Good. Now there are 3 props we have to set. The first one is data, which we set to an array of objects. So for now, as a temporary solution, let's create an array of objects here. Later in the future, when we connect our app to the backend, we're going to retrieve the list of messages from the backend. Okay. So I'm going to declare an array of messages. Here we're going to add an object with a few properties. ID we set to 1. Title we set to T1. Description we set to D1. And image, this is going to be the image of the user. Again, as a temporary solution, here we have to use the require function so we can load an asset statically. So we're in the screens folder. We're going to go 1 level up, then go to our assets and load mosh.jpg. So here's our first message. Let's duplicate this. And here we need a comma. Now for the second message, let's change the ID to 2. Let's change the title and description as well. Okay, so here we have an array of messages. Now let's set the data prop to messages. The second prop we have to set is key extractor. Here we have to pass a function that is used to extract a unique key from each object in our array. So we can pass an arrow function like message goes to. Now what property of a message can we use to uniquely identify each message? The ID property, okay? But here we need to convert this to a string, otherwise we'll get a warning. So here's our key extractor function. And finally, the last prop we have to set is render item, which we set to a function for rendering each item. Now let's go back to the documentation and take a look at the render item function. Look at the syntax here. Here we have object destructuring. So the parameter of the render item function is an object that has these 3 properties: item, index, and separators. So back to our code, we type a pair of parentheses. So here we're going to have that argument, but we're going to destructure it right away. And here we're going to pick the item property, okay? Now this goes to represent each item, we're going to use our list item component, the list item component that we built in the last section. So let's import list item. Well, VS Code didn't recognize this, so we have to manually import it on the top. So import list item from, we go up to components and load list item. Okay. Now we're going to render a list item. Now, as you remember, our list item component has 3 props: title, subtitle, and image. So we're going to set title to item, the title, subtitle to item, the description, and image to item, that image. Okay. Now, as a side note, maybe it would be better if we call this prop description. I think that kind of makes more sense, but this is a tiny issue. We don't have to worry about it at this point. Now let's test our application up to this point. So save the changes. Now we go to our app.js and render our new screen. So messages screen. Okay. Let's see what we get. So here's our flat list. I know it looks a bit ugly. We're going to improve it over the next few videos. The first issue we have here is that our list is not in the safe area. So it's going to get covered by the status bar and the notch on iPhone. We'll fix that in the next lesson. The first thing we should address here is the issue with our content going under the status bar. So we should wrap it inside a safe area view. So here we add a safe area view. Now let's take a look. So the problem is resolved on iOS, but at the time of recording this video, we still have this problem on Android. We talked about this earlier in the course. So safe area view only solves the problem on iOS. To solve this problem, I showed you a technique before. We can use the platform API to detect the current platform. And if it's Android, we can apply some extra padding on the top. So let's review that real quick. First, we go to the top and import the style sheet module, as well as the platform and status bar APIs. Okay. Now down the bottom, we're going to create a styles object. So RNSS, let's call it screen. Here we apply padding top. So if platform.os equals Android, then we're going to apply padding equal to the height of the status bar. So status bar dot current height. Otherwise, we're going to apply no padding. Okay. So let's apply this new style. So over here, we set style to styles dot screen. Save the changes. Now take a look. So iOS looks good, but what about Android? That looks perfect. Now let me show you a different way to achieve the same result. We can use expo constants. So let's install a library called expo-constants. Okay, I'm using expo constants version 9. Now on the top, let's import constants from expo constants. Note that I'm not wrapping this inside braces because this is the default object that is exported from this module, okay? Now, this constants gives us a bunch of information about the current platform. So let me show you real quick. Here we can do a console.log and log the constants object. Now take a look. So here's the constants object. We have a bunch of properties here like device ID, device name, device year class. We can tell if this is a real device or not. So a bunch of useful properties. Now, one of the properties that we're going to use in this video is status bar height over here. So on Android, the height of the status bar is 24 pixels. And on iOS, it's 44 pixels. So back to our code. Let's remove this log statement. Now down the bottom, we can simplify this expression. So here we can use constants dot status bar height. That's all we have to do. So on Android, we get 24 pixels here, and on iOS, we get 44 pixels. Now, would it apply extra padding on iOS? No, it wouldn't, because the safe area view component we are using already applies 44 pixels. So the padding top we specify here has no impact on iOS. Now take a look. So save the changes. Here's my iPhone. Beautiful. Now on Android, the issue is resolved. So by using expo constants, we no longer need to import the platform and status bar APIs. So our code is simpler. So let's get rid of these. Now, there is a problem with this implementation. The problem is that every time we want to create a new screen that should be inside a safe area view, we have to repeat all these steps. First, we have to import the safe area view component. We have to give it a style. We have to use expo constants. This is repetitive. So we can encapsulate all these details inside a reusable component. Let me show you. So we go to our project, and inside our components folder, we add a new component called screen.js. Let's create a function component. Now, here we're going to import expo constants. So import constants from expo-constants. Then we're going to import style sheet from React Native. Next, we're going to create our styles object. So all the details for putting our content inside a safe area view will be implemented here. So let's add a new key called screen. And here we set padding top to constants dot status bar height. Now, here we're going to use our safe area view component and give it this style, styles.screen. Now, we want to use this component, the screen component, exactly like the safe area view component. So we should be able to pass children inside this component. How can we do this? We can use the children prop. So props.children. This is exactly the same technique we use to implement our app text component. Okay. Now here we can simplify our code and destructure this argument. So we pick the children property and render it right here. So we're done with this component. Now we have a single place where we have all the details for adding our content inside a safe area view. So let's use this component on our messages screen. I'm going to replace this with our screen component. Now here we don't have auto import, so we have to manually import it on the top. That is super easy. Import screen from, we go up to components and load the screen module. Next, we're going to remove this prop because we don't have to apply this style anymore. All our styles are encapsulated inside this component, right? So delete. Now, let's replace safe area view with screen as well. With this implementation, we no longer need the styles object, but I'm not going to delete it now because it is very likely that later on we're going to add some styles to our messages screen. I'm just going to delete this object over here. Okay. Now let's go to the top. We no longer need the safe area view. So remove. We don't need the constants object anymore. Our code is simpler. Let's test our implementation. So here's my iPhone, beautiful, and here's my Android. Perfect. Next, we're going to add a separator between our list items. Now we want to add a separator between each item in this list. There are two ways to achieve this. We can go to our list item component and add a border below each item. We just need to apply a style. The problem with this approach is that we'll end up with an extra line after the last item. Then we'll have to do some hacking to remove the border from the last item. Not a good solution. The better solution is to use a separator component. Let me show you. So this flat list component has a prop called item separator component. Look at the naming convention. I is capitalized, so it's different from the other props because here we have to pass a component. So we can pass a function component here. So this is where we pass props for that component, but in this case, we don't need props. So that's why I'm passing an empty pair of parentheses. So here we want to render a view. We can use the self-closing syntax. Now we need to apply a bunch of styles here. So for now, I'm going to write these styles inline so you can see how this component works. And then we're going to come back and refactor our code. So I'm going to set the width of this view to 100%, its height to 1 pixel, and its background color to black for now. Okay, save the changes, take a look. We got this error because I didn't import the view component. So let's fix that real quick. Here's the view. So here's our separator. And as you can see, we don't have this separator after the last item. Beautiful. Now back to our code. There is a problem with this implementation. It is very likely that we're going to have another list of items somewhere else in our app. We don't want to repeat all this code every time we want to render a separator. So let's encapsulate this view inside a reusable component. So we go to our project and in the components folder, add a new file called list item separator. We add a function component. Now I'm going to move the code that we wrote to our new component. So we just want to render a view like this, right? So cut this. Now let's return this view over here. Now we're going to create our styles using the style sheet API. So let's import style sheet and then use it over here. So let's call this key separator. Now here we're going to set the width to 100%, the height to 1 pixel, and the background color, I'm going to use a light gray color that we should bring from our color palette. So let's import our color palette on the top. So import colors from, we go to config and load the colors module. Now, we set the background color to colors dot. We don't have this light gray, so let's add it real quick. We go to our colors module. We have medium gray, so let's add light gray. Let's set this to F8, F4, F4. Save. Now back to our new component. So here we set the background color to colors.light. Good. Now finally, let's apply our new style. So let's get rid of this object and set the style to styles.separator. Also, we don't need the props, so let's clean up our code. So now we have a reusable separator that we can use in multiple places in our app. So back to the messages screen. I'm going to replace this function with our function component. So list item separator. Now save the changes. We have this error because we didn't import the view component in our separator component. So let's import the view. Okay, now here's our separator. The light gray is very subtle. You can make it darker if you prefer. I'm happy with it for now. There's just one more thing I want to improve. We need some padding in our list item because currently the content is so close to the edges of the screen. So let's go to our list item component. So we have a bunch of studs for our container. This is where we can apply the padding. So down the bottom, here's our container. Let's give it a padding of 20 pixels. Okay, it looks much better. What if we set it to 15? I think that's perfect. So next we're going to talk about handling selections. So currently our list item doesn't respond to selections. So if you tap on an item, nothing happens. How can we solve this problem? Well, here's our list item component. We need to wrap our content inside a touchable component. So earlier we talked about different touchable components in React Native. We have touchable highlight, touchable opacity, and touchable without feedback. Most of the time we want to use the first two touchable components because we want to give the user a visual feedback when they tap on an item. So which touchable component should we use here? Let's find out. So back to our list item component, let's add a touchable opacity component. So here's our touchable opacity. Now let's test our app. So with touchable opacity, the opacity of the item that we tap changes for a fraction of a second. So that item becomes somehow transparent. See? I don't think this is a good visual feedback for list items because typically with list items, when we tap on them, we want to highlight the selected item using a different background color. So this is where we use touchable highlight. So let's replace the touchable opacity with touchable highlight. Now, save the changes. So back to our app. With touchable highlight, nothing happens unless we handle the onPress event. So here we set onPress to an arrow function. Now let's test it one more time. Okay, so the background of the selected item changes to black. This is too strong. We want to use a light gray background. To do that, we set the underlay color prop. So this touchable highlight has a prop called underlay color. Here I'm going to use colors.light. Take a look. That is much better. So our list item is responding to selections. However, we don't want to have the logic for handling selections in this component because this component should be reusable. Maybe in one context, when we tap an item, we want to display an alert. In another context, we want to take the user to a different screen. So what should happen when the user taps on an item should be decided by the consumer of the list item component. So here we add a new prop called onPress and then set onPress to onPress. Now save. We go back to our messages screen. This is where we're using the list item component. So the messages screen should decide what should happen when the user taps on a message. So here we set onPress to a function. For now, we're just going to log the selected message to the console. In the future, we're going to change this implementation and take the user to a different screen. So here we're going to do a console.log and say message selected. And as the second argument, we're going to pass this item, that is the item you're rendering. So that is our message. Save. Back to our app. So I select this item. Now look at the terminal. Here's the message we selected. Beautiful. Next, we're going to handle swipes. Now we're going to improve our list item and give it the ability to respond to swipes. So if we swipe left here, we should see a red box with an icon for deleting this message. To do that, we go to docs.expo.io. Let's look at the API reference. Here on the left, we have gesture handler. So we're going to use a library for handling gestures. Now look at the installation. Here we have expo, install, React Native Gesture Handler. So this is the library we're going to install, but we're going to install it with Expo instead of NPM. The difference is that when we use Expo, Expo makes sure that this library is compatible with the version of Expo we are using. So if you're using a library that is part of Expo ecosystem, it's better to install it with Expo. Under the hood, Expo uses NPM or Yarn to install that library. So here on the left, you can see all the libraries that are part of Expo ecosystem. For any of these, we're going to install them using Expo. So let's copy this line and paste it in our terminal window. Okay, this library is installed. Now let's have a quick look at the documentation. So on this page, you can see a link to React Native Gesture Handler docs. So let's read the docs. Here on the left, you can see we have various gesture handlers. So we can handle pans, taps, long presses, rotations, flinks, and so on. In this lesson, we're going to use this component, swipeable. This makes it incredibly easy to implement swipeable rows. So we can swipe to left or to right. It's very easy. Now let's have a quick look at how we should import this component. So we import swipeable from React Native Gesture Handler /swipeable. So I'm going to copy this line. Now here in listitem.js, let's import this component on the top. Good. Now we should wrap our list item with the swipeable component. It's very easy. So we add swipeable here. Now, here we should set a prop called render right actions. We also have render left actions. In this video, we're going to use render right actions. So these are the actions we want to show on the right side of our list item. So if we swipe to left, these actions will appear on the right side of the list item, okay? So render right actions. Now here we should pass a function for rendering these right actions, but we're not going to implement that function here because we want our list item to be reusable. So what we show here will vary from one context to another. So we should let the consumer of our list item determine what should appear when we swipe left. So I'm going to add another prop here, render right actions, and then pass it over here. Okay, save the changes. Now we go to our messages screen. This is where we're using our list item. So here I'm going to set render right actions to a function for rendering a basic view. I just want to make sure that swiping works. So here we pass an arrow function to render a view with a bunch of inline styles. Again, this is just a temporary solution. Next, we're going to extract this view and put it in a reusable component. So here we're going to set a couple of properties. Background color should be red and width should be 70 pixels. Save. So we set render right actions to a function that returns a view. Okay, let's test our implementation. So now we swipe to left. Here's our red box, beautiful. Now we want to extract this into a reusable component because somewhere else we might have a list of items. We don't want to repeat all this code to render this red box. So here in our project, in the components folder, let's add a new component called list item delete action.js. So we implement a function component. Now here we want to return a view. Let's give it a bunch of styles. So we import the style sheet module on the top and then use it over here. Let's add a key called container. Here we set background color to, I don't want to use the red I showed you because that's very strong. So let's go to our color palette and introduce a new color called danger. We set this to FF5252. This is a different shade of red that is not too strong. So save. Now let's import our color palette. So import colors from, we go up to config/colors. And then we set background color to colors the danger. Next, we set the width to 70 pixels. And then we apply our styles over here. Styles.container. So now we have a reusable component. Let's use it on our messages screen. So here, I'm going to replace this function with the component that we just created. So delete. Here we pass list item delete action. note that I'm not rendering a component like this. I'm simply passing a reference to this function, to our function component, okay? So save the changes. Let's test our implementation. Okay, beautiful. Now let's add an icon here. So we go to list item, delete action. Inside this view, we want to add an icon. So on the top, I'm going to import from @expo/vector icons. I'm going to import material community icons and then use it over here. So material community icons, I'm going to render a trash can with a size of 35 pixels. And I'm going to set the color to colors.white. Save. Now, let's reload our app. Okay, we have the icon, but we should put it in the center of the red box. So here's our container. We set justify content and align items to center. Okay, let's test it one more time. So we reload. And everything is working beautifully. So next we're going to implement deleting an item. So we are in list item delete action component. Now to delete an item, we should wrap this view with a touchable component so we can handle the onPress event. So here I'm going to use touchable without feedback because both touchable opacity and touchable highlight look kind of weird in this context when we swipe an item to left and see the red box. So let's move the view inside our touchable component. Now here we handle the onPress event. Now what should be right here? Well, just like before, we want to keep this component reusable. So we don't want to implement the logic for deleting a message here because tomorrow we may use this component somewhere else, let's say in the list of notes. So when we try to delete a note, we don't want to delete a message. So where we use this component, that's where we should decide how to delete an item, not here. So I'm going to give this component a new prop called onPress. So this is a function that we pass from the outside. And here we simply delegate to that function. As simple as that. We're done with this component, so let's save the changes. Now we go to the messages screen. So this is where we're using our list item delete action, but there's a problem here. With this syntax, we cannot set the onPress prop. To solve this, we have to pass a function here and render the list item delete action. So now we have a component so we can set its props. I'm going to put this on a new line. Now let's set onPress to a function. For now, let's just log the message on the console. So here we pass an arrow function and log the item. So this is the item that we tap on. It's currently in the scope, so we can access it and log it on the console. Let's test our implementation up to this point. So save. Now tap. So here's the message we want to delete. Beautiful. Now, deleting a message is more than a line of code. So I don't want to implement that logic here. I want to implement it in a separate function. So in this function component, we're going to define another function called handle delete. This function takes a message. Now in this function, we should do two things. First, we should delete the message from the messages array. And then we need to call the server to delete the message from the backend as well. Now we're going to talk about the second step in the future when we talk about connecting our app to the backend. So for now, we just want to delete this message from our messages array. But there's a problem. If we remove an object from this array, our function component is not going to get re-rendered. For this to happen, we need to have state in our component. That's just basic React. So whenever we update the state, our components, whether they are function or class components, get re-rendered. So back to our function component, here we need to declare a state variable. But how can we do that? Aren't function components stateless? Well, they used to be, not anymore. So with the addition of hooks in React, now function components have all the capabilities that we have in class components. So to declare a state variable here, we're going to use a hook. A hook is just a function that allows us to hook into React features in function components. So here we're going to use the state hook to declare a state variable in this function component. So on the top, we're going to import a function called useState. So whenever you see a function whose name starts with use, that is a hook. It's just a JavaScript function. There's no magic about it. But these functions, these hooks, are only available in function components. We cannot use them in class components. Let's see how we can use this hook. It's very easy. So let's say we want to declare a state variable called count. We call useState. We can give our count an initial value. Now this returns an array. So we store it over here. Now the first element in this array is our state variable. So we can call that count. And the second element is a function for updating the state variable. By convention, we call it setCount. So this function is similar to the setState function that we have in class components, okay? Now we can combine these three lines into a single line using array destructure syntax. So we can destructure this array right away and pick the first and second elements, okay? Now in this component, we don't need a count variable. We need an array of messages. So let's go to the top and rename this array to initial messages so we don't have name conflicts. Now, instead of 0, I'm going to use initial messages here as the initial object for our array of messages. Now let's rename these elements to messages and set messages. So now that we have state in this function, we can go to our handle delete function and remove this message, remove this object from our array of messages. How do we do that? Using the filter method. So we call messages.filter. We want to get all messages except this message object. This is just basic React. So here we pass an arrow function, m goes to m.id does not equal to message.id. This returns a new array, so we can store it over here. And then we call set messages and give it this new array. So we're updating state, and this will cause a re-render, okay? Now we can combine these two lines into a single line. So let's move this expression over here. That's better. Now the final part, we need to use this function. So over here, instead of console.log, we should call handle delete. Let's test our implementation. So save the changes and let's delete this message. It's gone. Beautiful. Let's delete this as well. Perfect. Next, we're going to implement pull to refresh. Now let's implement pull to refresh. So when we pull down this list, it should get refreshed. This is very easy. So here in messages screen, this is where we're using our flat list. To implement pull to refresh, we have to set a couple of extra props. So the first one is refreshing. We should set this to a Boolean state variable. So let's declare another state variable. So here we call useState one more time. We give our state variable an initial value, false. This returns an array, so we can destructure it straight away. Now we call the first element refreshing and the second element set refreshing. And by the way, we should call these hooks at the beginning of our function components, so we cannot call them somewhere in the middle. I explained the reason in my React course. So now that we have a Boolean state variable, let's use it over here. So we bind this prop to our state variable. Next, we should set onRefresh to a function for updating the list of messages. So this is where we're going to call the backend to retrieve the new list of messages. But for now, let's just simulate this on the client. So I'm going to pass a function. In this function, I'm going to call set messages and give it a new array. So a new array. Now to save time, I'm going to copy a message object from the top. So the second message, let's paste it over here. So with this implementation, when we pull down the list, the first message should disappear because we only have the second message in this array, okay? Let's test our app. So save the changes. Now take a look. So the first message disappeared. So implementing pull to refresh is super easy, but there is a tiny problem in our app. Let me reload the app and show you one more time. So note that when I pull this list down, we see some kind of cutoff around here. Take a look. Did you notice? Let me explain why this is happening. So take a look at our messages screen component. We're wrapping this flat list with our screen component. Let's go to our screen component and give the screen a background color. So background color of, let's say, yellow. See, our component is not growing to take the entire screen. And this is the reason why we have that cutoff. So if I reload the app, look, our messages screen is only taking a third of the screen. So when I pull this down, this is exactly where we had the cutoff. To solve this problem, we need to set flex to 1. So whenever we use the screen component, that component takes the entire screen. Now, let's test our app one more time. So manually reload it, pull down, the problem is gone. Beautiful. Let's spend a couple of minutes and plan what we're going to build and how we're going to do it. We're going to build my account screen, which looks like this. Now, there are two ways to implement this screen. One way is to implement it using the section list component in React Native. So section list is similar to flat list. It has all those features we have talked about so far, but it also has support for section headers and section separators. So we can implement the screen using a section list with 3 sections, 1, 2, and 3. But in my opinion, section list is a bit of overkill for such a simple screen. So I leave it up to you to read about section list in case you need it in your applications. Here we're going to take a different route. On the top, we're going to have a list item on its own. So this is not going to be part of a flat list. Now we're going to put this inside a container and apply a margin below that container. So we have this separation. Then we're going to have a flat list with 2 list items. Now, once again, we're going to put this flat list inside a container that has a margin below it. And finally here, we're going to have a single independent list item. So essentially on this screen, we have 2 independent list items and a flat list in the middle. That's how we're going to implement this. Now we're going to implement this step by step. So first we're going to build a reusable icon component that looks like this. Once we have that ready, then we're going to extend our list item so it has support for rendering icons. Currently, it can only render images. So that will be our next step. Once we have all these building blocks ready, then we'll go ahead and build my account screen. And this is the mindset I want you to have when building software. Always divide your work into a series of baby steps. Work on a small piece of functionality, build it, test it, make sure it works, and then move on to the next step. So next, we're going to build a reusable icon component that looks like this. So here in the app component, let's remove the messages screen and render a basic screen component. So we want to have some padding on the top. Now VS Code didn't import this component, so you have to manually import it. Import screen from app/components/screen. Now inside this screen component, we want to render our icon component. So we just want to test it here in the app component. So we want to have an icon component with these props. We should be able to set its name, let's say email. We should be able to set its size, let's say 50. We should also be able to set its background and foreground color. So background color, that is the color of the circle. Let's set it to red and icon color to white. So let's go ahead and implement an icon component with this interface. So here in the components folder, we add a new file called icon.js. We implement a function component. Now here we need a view that acts as the container for our icon. So that is the circle over here. So let's add a view. Now we need to give this a bunch of styles. But some of these styles are dynamic. We have to set them based on our props. So let's destructure the props object. What props do we need here? We need the name of the icon. We need its size, its background color, and foreground color. Now, I would like to give this some default values so we don't have to specify them when using the icon component. This makes it easier to use this component. So I'm going to give the size a default value of 40. And background color, I'm going to make it black. And the icon color is going to be white. Now here we could also use the colors in our palette. It doesn't really matter in this case because we're implementing a reusable icon component. This has nothing to do with the branding of our app, okay? So black and white works totally fine here. Now, let's give this view a bunch of styles. So here we pass an object. We set the width to size, the height to size as well, and border radius to size divided by 2. With this, we get a full circle, okay? Next, we set the background color to the background color prop. Here we can use the shorthand syntax in modern JavaScript. So if the key and the value are the same, we can remove the value and just use the key, okay? Now, inside this container, let's add an icon. So on the top, I want to import material community icons. So import from @expo/vector icons. Let's import material community icons. Now we're going to use it inside our container. So material community icons, I'm going to set the name to the name of our icon. That is our prop over here. We should also give it this color. So we set color to icon color and size to. Now let's say this icon should be half the size of its circle. So size times 0.5. Save the changes. Let's test our implementation up to this point. So save app.js. Now, here we have an error. Can't find variable icon because we didn't import it in app.js. So import icon from app/component/icon. Let's try again. So here's what we have. We need to put the icon in the center of the circle. So here we need to apply a couple more styles. What properties should we set to put something in the center of a container? You should know that by now. Justify content and align items, right? Save, take a look. So our icon is working. Now let's test its default values. So in app.js, what if we remove these 3 props? So delete. Now we should have a smaller icon that is black and white. Beautiful. What if we change the size to, let's say 100? Everything works perfectly. So now we have a reusable icon component. Next, we're going to extend our list item component and give it the ability to render an icon. Now, we want to extend our list item and give it the ability to render an icon. So here in app component, let's delete this icon and add a list item. We give it a couple of props. Title, we set it to my title, and subtitle, we set it to my subtitle. Now this component is not completely reusable because earlier we assumed that our list item always has an image. Currently we haven't supplied an image, so let's see what we get. Save. So here's our list item, but what is this space? This is the placeholder for our image. So if we don't supply an image, we don't want to have this space over here. Let's fix that real quick. So here in list item, down below, we have defined the styles for our image. We have a width of 70 pixels. That is the reason why we have that extra space. So where are we rendering the image? Over here. We should change this code and render the image component only if we have the image prop. So we wrap this line with braces and then type image and just a basic conditional rendering technique in React. Save the changes. Take a look. The space is gone. Beautiful. So look at the props for this component. We have title, subtitle, image, and so on. To add an icon, we can introduce a few other props like icon name, icon color, icon background color, and icon size. We'll end up with 4 extra props, and this will make the interface of this component a little bit convoluted. A better approach is to introduce a single extra prop. So I'm going to add a prop here called image component. Now look at the naming convention. I have capital I and capital C here because we should set this prop to a real component, okay? Now, this is where we have our image. Just before that, we can render an icon. So we add our braces and render the image component that is passed from the outside. If we don't set this prop, image component is going to be undefined and we're not going to render anything here. With this, we can go to app.js and set image component prop to our icon component. So here we render an icon, and this is where we specify all the attributes of our icon. So we can set its name, its size, as well as its background and foreground color. We don't need to convolute the interface of this component with 4 extra props, okay? So let's render an email icon here. So save, take a look. So here's our icon, but we need some extra space after the icon. So back to our list item component. Look at the styles we have defined for our image. Here we have a margin right of 10 pixels. We can take the same approach and define a style for our icon, and there we can apply a margin right of 10 pixels. But that is a bit of duplication. A better approach is to remove this margin right from here and apply a margin left to the container for these 2 text components. So here's the view or the container for our text components. I'm going to set the style to styles, the details container. Now let's implement this object. So here we set a margin left of 10 pixels. Save. Okay, here's what we get. Looks pretty good to me. Now there is one more thing we need to address here. Back to app.js. What if we don't supply a subtitle? So delete, see what happens. Here's our title. In this case, it would be nicer if this title was vertically centered. So back to our list item. Here's the details container. We want to align this component along the primary axis, which is in this case, this vertical axis. So here we set justify content to center. And then we have to go over here and conditionally render this app text component. So let's wrap this with braces and type subtitle and save the changes. Take a look. Now our title is in the center of this row. Beautiful. So our list item is ready. Next, we're going to build the account screen. All our building blocks are ready. So now let's build the account screen. This is probably going to take 10 minutes of our time. So here in the screens folder, let's add a new file called account screen.js. We start by creating a function component. Now we want to wrap everything inside our screen component. Now VS Code doesn't suggest auto importing this component. I'm not sure why. It doesn't like this component. So we have to manually import it on the top. Import screen from. Currently we are in the screens folder. So we go one level up, then to components and screen. Now here on the top, we want to have a list item. So list item. Once again, I'm not sure why VS Code is not suggesting to import this. So let's manually import it on the top. We import list item from our components folder. Now, we should give this 3 props. Title, we set it to our name. Subtitle, we set it to an email. And image, we set this to. Here we use the require function. Then we go to our assets folder and load some image. Let's test our implementation up to this point. So save the changes. Now we go to app.js and here we render our account screen. So account screen. This time auto importing worked. So it's kind of flaky. I'm not sure why. Now, here's what we get. Looks good to me. Now below this list item, we want to have a flat list with 2 menu items. As I told you before, I want to wrap this inside a container and give it some vertical margin. So back to account screen. On the top, let's type imrn to import style sheet from React Native. Then down below, we're going to create a styles object. So RNSS. We're going to create a container here and give it a margin vertical of 20 pixels. Now, let's wrap this inside a container. So we add a view and give it the style of container. Now let's move the list item inside this view. So here's our first container. Then we add another container. So I'm going to copy this line and paste it over here. So in the second container, we're going to add a flat list. That is really easy. Flat list. Now we should set 3 props here. The first prop is data. We should set this to an array of objects. So I'm going to create this array outside of our function component because we don't want to recreate this array every time our component gets re-rendered. So let's create an array called menu items. Here we add an object and set its title to my listings. Now we should also give this an icon. So let me put this on a new line. I'm going to set the icon to an object with 2 properties, name and background color. For this menu item, I'm going to use an icon called format-list-bulleted. And I'm going to set the background color to our primary color. So let's import our color palette. Import colors from config/colors. Now I just noticed that VS Code imported the flat list from React Native gesture handler. I'm not sure if this is going to work properly. We should make sure to import flat list from React Native. So this is one of the problems with auto import. I love it. It's a great productivity tool, but sometimes it imports an object from the wrong package. So always double check this. So now let's remove this flat list. Okay. So on the top, we have all the import statements from third-party libraries, and then we have all the import statements from our code. Now, back to our menu item, we set the background color to colors.primary. Now let's duplicate this object. For our second menu item, we're going to set its title to my messages. The name of its icon should be email, and the background color should be secondary. Now, let's pass this array to the data prop, menu items. The second prop we have to set here is key extractor. And with this, we can uniquely identify each item. How can we uniquely identify each menu item here? Do we need an ID property? No, we can just use their title. So item goes to item.title. We could also rename this to menu item for consistency. Finally, the third prop is render item. Now, as I told you before, we set this to a function. This function has an argument. We need to destructure that and pick the item property. Okay? So we get this item, and here we render a list item. Now, we should set the title to item.title. And here we should set the icon. So icon component, I just realized that I call this prop image component. So that is a mistake I made in the previous lesson. That is a result of working late. So technically this should be icon component. We'll come back and fix this later. Let's set this to an icon. So we use our icon component here. We set its name to item.icon.name and background color to item.icon.background color. Pretty simple, right? So let's save the changes and preview our app. So it looks good. Now I would like to give the screen a background color so these menu items stand out. So on the top, let's give the screen a style. We set this to styles.screen and then create it down below. So we set screen to an object and set its background color to colors.light. Now save the changes. This is not working because our screen component doesn't support additional styles. So let's go to our screen component. This is really easy to fix. We need to add an extra prop here called style and then apply it over here. We've already done this before. So here we pass an array. The first object in this array is the screen object that we created over here. And the second object is the style that we pass as a prop. Now save. Okay, our screen has a light gray background. You may not notice it because list items have the same background color. Well, more accurately, they don't have a background color. So what we see here is the background of our screen. So to make the list items pop out, we have to set their background color to white. So let's go to our list item component. So here's the container for each list item. We set the background color to colors.white. Now here we're breaking the rule. So this may impact the reusability of this component because maybe somewhere else in a different app, we don't want our list items to have a white background. But in this course, I'm not intending to create a completely reusable list item component that we can use in every kind of app. So I'm designing this component mainly for this app. So it's okay to break the rules in this context. So let's save the changes. And we get this beautiful interface. Now one thing is missing, and that is the separator component. So back to the account screen. Here's our flat list. Let's set its separator. So it's called item separator component. We set this to list item separator component. Once again, VS Code didn't pick this up. I'm not sure what's going on here. Maybe I have to do a restart. So let's import this component. We import list item separator component from this module. Save the changes. And here's our separator. Beautiful. Now the last part, we need to add the logout menu here. So after our second container, we add another container. Now in this case, we don't really need this container. So we can just use a list item. Now we set its title to logout and its image component, or more accurately, icon component, to an icon. The name of this icon is logout, and I'm going to set its background color to, where is my cheat sheet? Okay, it is FFE66D. Now in this case, I'm hard coding this value here. I don't want to add it to our color palette because it is likely that tomorrow we're going to have a bunch of menu items here and we're going to have different colors. These colors are specific to the icons for this screen. They're not part of our color palette. So I don't want to pollute our color palette with too many colors. So save the changes. And here's the final result. Let's see how it looks on Android. It looks beautiful to me. Now the last thing I want to do here is rename image component to icon component. So we press F2 here and rename this to icon component. Let's make sure that it's updated over here as well. Beautiful. What about our component? It's not updated here. So let's rename this to icon component as well. Now VS Code adds an alias here. So it thinks when we use the list item component, we set the image component prop. So that is why it kept the prop name, but it gave it an alias. So internally it's called icon component. Now in this case, we can safely remove the alias and just use icon component because we removed the prop outside of this component. Let's make sure everything is working. Beautiful. So we're done here. Let's move on to the next task. Now let's build the listing screen. So here in the screens folder, let's add a new file, listings screen.js. Just like before, we create a function component. We want to wrap everything with our screen component. Once again, VS Code is not helping with importing this component. So we have to manually import it on top. Import screen from the components folder. Now, what do we need here? We need a flat list. We need a flat list to render a bunch of cards. So let's import the flat list component. Now look, we have two flat list components. The first one, as you see in the tooltip, is the one defined in React Native gesture handler. And the second one is the one defined in React Native. I'm not familiar with the flat list defined in this library. So let's import the right flat list. Now I want to move this to the top. So all the import statements from third-party libraries are in one place. Now here we need to set three props. Data, which we set to an array of objects. So let's define that over here. We call that listings. this is a temporary solution. In the future, when we talk about connecting our app to the backend, we're going to retrieve the listings from the server. Okay. So let's add a couple of objects here. We give each listing an ID so we can uniquely identify them. Let's set the title of the first object to red jacket for sale for $100. And we're going to give it an image. Once again, because this is a temporary solution, here we have to use the require function. Again, this is a temporary solution. In the future, we're going to have an image URL here. Okay. So here we're going to go to our assets folder and load jacket.jpg. Now let's add another listing. We change the ID to 2. Let's set the title to couch in great condition for $1,000. And we set the image to couch.jpg. Now we set data to listings. Now the second prop we have to set is key extractor. We set this to a function like this. Listing goes to listing.id, the toString. This is really important. We have to convert this number to a string because flatlist expects a string as a unique identifier. Otherwise, we'll get a warning. And finally, we set render item to a function. As I told you before, we need to destructure the argument and pick the item property. Now here we want to render a card. What props should we set? Each card has 3 props. A title, which we set to item.title. It also has subtitle, which we set to item.price. Well, here we want to format this as a monetary value. So we can just add a $sign and append the price. A very basic solution. So we're not going to separate every 3 digits with a comma. For now, it does the job. So let's move on. Finally, we need to set the image to item.image. Let's test our implementation up to this point. So save the changes. Now we go to app.js and render our new screen, listings screen. So now auto import works. I'm not sure what's going on. Now, here we have an error because the card component was not imported. So back to our listing screen. On the top, we import the card component. Now let's take a look. So here's what we get. Now we need to apply some padding so our cards are not so close to the edges of the screen. So on the top, let's import the style sheet module. Then we're going to create our styles object. So I'm going to create a style for our screen and give it a padding of 20 pixels. I also want to set the background color here, background color. Now we should import our colors palette. So import colors from config/colors. Now let's set the background color to colors.light. And finally, we need to apply our style. So we set style to styles.screen. Let's see what happens. So we have the background color, but padding is not applied. So let's go to our screen component. At the time of recording this video, this component doesn't support horizontal padding. So even if we apply, let's say, a padding left of 50 pixels here, see, nothing happens. So to work around this, we have to add a view inside our safe area view and apply the padding there. So let's render a view component. Now we're going to render our children inside this view. So here's our new structure. Now the style that we passed from outside, we should apply them to this view as well. So we set the style to this style object. Now save the changes. The problem is solved. In this section, we're going to talk about getting input from the user. First, we're going to talk about the input components available in the React Native core. Then we're going to talk about building pretty text boxes. And finally, I'm going to show you how to build a cross-platform picker component from scratch. So when we tap on this component, it shows a modal box with a list of items to choose from. This is a very exciting section, so let's jump in and get started. The first input component we're going to talk about is text input, which we use for getting text from the user. It has a bunch of useful props like auto-capitalize, auto-correct, autofocus, and so on. So back in VS Code, I've simplified the code in app component. Here we only have a screen component, and over the next few lessons, I'm going to demo our input components inside this screen component. So let's add a text input. Now look, we have two instances of this component. One instance is defined in React Native gesture handler. The other instance is defined in React Native. This is the instance that we need. So let's import this. Now let's save the changes and see what we get. By default, we don't see anything, but there is actually a text input right here. So we can type something. Now to make this stand out a bit more, we can give it a placeholder. That is the default text that appears in an empty text box. So let's set this to first name. Now we have to manually reload the app because we're currently in the edit mode. So reload. Okay, here's the placeholder. We can also apply a bottom border. That makes this text input stand out a bit more. So here we set the style property to an object with a couple of properties. I'm going to set border bottom color to CCC and border bottom width to 1 pixel. See what we get. Now it's a bit more clear that we are dealing with a text input. In the next lesson, we're going to apply a bunch of pretty styles to this text input and then encapsulate it inside a reusable component. For now, let's not worry about it. So how can we use this text input component? Exactly the same way we use an input element in React. So in this component, we need a state variable to hold the current value of this text input. How do we declare a state variable? Using the state hook. We talked about this in the previous section. So on the top, let's import useState from React. Now, in this component, we call this function. We can give our state variable a default value, like an empty string. If we don't supply this, by default, it's going to be undefined. Now, this returns an array, so we can destructure that and pick the first and the second elements. The first element is our state variable, so first name, and the second element is a function for updating the state variable. We call it set first name. Now, we need to subscribe to the unchanged text event. So whenever the user types something in this text input, we get that text and update the first name. So here we pass a function that takes the current value, the current text in our text input, and then we call set first name to that value. Now to demo this, I'm going to put a text component over here and render the first name. Let's see what we get. So let's type my name. Everything works beautiful. So this is how we use the text input component in React Native. Now let's look at a few useful props. The first one I'm going to talk about is max length. You're probably familiar with this. It's pretty straightforward. We also have keyboard type. This is very useful. We can set it to one of these values. So I'm going to set this to numeric. Now we have to reload the app. If we bring up the soft keyword, we can toggle that using Command and K. Look, we only see numbers. Another useful prop is clear button mode. With this, we can specify when the clear button should appear. This only works on iOS. So if we set this to one of these values, like always, let's see what happens. So the moment I start typing something here, we get this clear button. It only works on iOS. And finally, the last prop I'm going to talk about is secure text entry. If we set this to true, we can capture passwords. Now let me show you a shorthand. If we have a Boolean prop and we want to set it to true, we can simply type the name of that prop. This is exactly like explicitly setting it to true. But here we don't have to type equals true. So save, take a look. We still have a password input box. So I leave it up to you to read about the other props here. Next, we're going to build a beautiful reusable text input component. In this lesson, we're going to build a pretty text input that looks the same across both platforms. So here's my iOS simulator and here's my Android virtual device. What we have here is much better than the default text input that comes with React Native. So let's see how we can implement this from scratch. So here in the components folder, let's add a new file. I'm going to call this app text input.js. So here we're using app as a prefix to distinguish our components from the components in React Native. This is the same convention we used earlier. Earlier, we built these two components, app button and app text. So let's implement a new component. In this component, we're going to have a container. So let's add a view. As you see, I fixed the auto import issue in VS Code. I just had to restart my machine. Now, inside this view, we're going to have an icon. So let's import from @expo/vector icons. Just like before, we're going to use material community icons. So first I'm going to add an icon, and then I'm going to add a text input. Now, as I told you in the last lesson, we're going to use the text input defined in React Native. So let's import that as well. Now, let's import our style sheet module and then create our styles. So what styles do we need here? For our container, we're going to apply a background color and a border radius so it looks pretty. And for our text input, we're going to set its font family and font size. So let's add a couple of objects here. The first one is container. Here we want to set the background color to light gray. So I'm going to import our colors palette. Import colors from, we go up to config/colors. Now, we're going to set the background color to colors.light. I'm going to give this a border radius of 25 pixels so we get round corners. We should set flex direction to row so our icon and text input are laid out horizontally. I also want to apply a width of 100% so our container stretches to fill its container. And then I'm going to apply a padding of 15 pixels so we have some room in our container. And finally, I'm going to apply a vertical margin, so margin vertical of 10 pixels. With this, we can separate multiple text inputs on the same screen. Now, let's set the style to styles.container. Now for our icon, we want to have a prop. So let's destructure this object. We want to be able to specify the icon from the outside. So let's set the name to icon. Now we want the icon to be optional. So we want to render this only if icon is defined. So let's wrap this in braces and use conditional rendering. Okay. Now our text input. Here we want to set the font size and font family. So let's set the style to styles.text input. Now we define this object, text input. For the font size, I'm going to use 18 pixels. And for font family, well, this one is a bit tricky. We have to cheat in this lesson. So we have to go to our app text component. Earlier, we used the platform API to set different fonts on different platforms. Now, we don't want to repeat this logic in multiple places, but we're in the middle of building a custom text input component. So let's not get distracted. For now, I'm just going to copy this expression, and then we're going to come back and refactor our code. So always try to focus on a single task. If you try to do too many things, you'll get distracted, and you may not be able to complete any of these tasks properly. So let's save the changes. Our new component is almost ready. So let's go to app.js and use it. So inside this screen component, I'm going to render an app text input. Now let's see what happens if we don't set any props here. So save the changes, and here's what we get. It looks pretty decent. What if we give it a placeholder? Placeholder to username. nothing happens because we are not applying this prop to our text input. How do we do that? Well, back to our component. Over here, we're destructuring the props arg. We're only picking the icon property. But what about the other properties? Well, here we can use the rest operator. So we can get the other props and put them inside a single object. Now, whatever those props are, we can apply them to this text input. So here we add braces and use the spread operator to spread other props. This is just basic React. If you're not familiar with this technique, you really need to go back and strengthen the fundamentals. So save the changes. Now we have our placeholder. Beautiful. Now let's set the icon. So back to app.js. I'm going to set the icon to email. Okay, we have a number of problems here. Our icon is too small, it's too dark, and it's too close to our text input. But these are really easy to fix. I'm going to set the size to 20. The color to colors.medium. And here we should apply a margin to the right side of this icon to separate it from the text input. So let's set the style to styles.icon. And then we implement the styles over here. So here we set margin, right, to let's say 10 pixels. Save, and here's what we get. It looks pretty good to me. The last thing I want to change is the color of the text that we type here. So our text is pure black. This is too strong. I want to make it a really dark gray. So let's go to our colors palette. Earlier we defined 2 shades of gray, medium, and light. So let's set dark to, let's say 0C, 0C, 0C. Now, back to our new component. Here are the styles for our text input. Let's set the color to colors.dark. Okay. Now our text is not pure black, it's really dark gray. Okay, I'm pretty happy with this component. In the future, we can come back and improve it if needed. In the last lesson, we borrowed this expression from another component. So now we have this expression in 2 places. And that means next time we're going to build a component where we need to set the default font. Again, we have to copy this expression. With this approach, if you want to change the default font, we have to dig all over the place and update all instances of this expression. So let me show you how we can extract our default styles and put them in a single place. Here in our project, inside the config folder, we add a new file called styles.js. Now, back to app text input, I'm going to copy this object. So this is where we're defining the default styles for our text. We want our text to be dark gray. We want it to be 18 pixels in size. And here's where we specify the default font depending on the current platform. So let's copy this object and paste it over here. Now on the top, we're going to import the platform API from React Native. We should also import the colors palette from the current folder because we're referencing it here. Now, we're going to export a default object. So this object represents our default styles. Now here we can have default styles for various aspects of our app. For this lesson, for this demo, I'm going to add an object here called text. And this is where we specify the default styles for our text. Now save the changes. We go back to our app text component. We no longer need this object, so let's delete it. Now, on the top, here we import our default styles from the config folder. And then over here, we set the style to default styles dot text. As simple as that. Now let's test our app. Everything works exactly like before. So let's go to our app text component. We should refactor this component and use our default text styles. So on the top, we import default styles from, we go up to the config folder and load the styles module. Now here we set default styles, the text. And with this, we no longer need this object over here. It's defined in a single place. And that means we no longer need these two APIs either. So our component is cleaner and more maintainable. Now we could also take this to the next level. So here in the styles object, we can add another property called colors and set it to our color palette. Or we can use the shorthand syntax. There is no need to repeat this. So we just type colors. Now, anywhere we import the default styles, we also have access to our color palette. For example, in app-text-input.js, let's see where we have used our color palette. So here's one reference, colors.medium. We can replace this with default styles.colors.medium. Let's see if we have any other references. Yes, we have one more reference. So let's prefix this with default styles. Good. Now we don't need to import our color palette anymore. So this simplifies our code. Beautiful. The next component we're going to talk about is switch, which we use to capture a Boolean value. Now this switch has different looks on iOS and Android. Let me show you. So back to VS Code, let's add a switch here. Now once again, we have two implementations. We have one implementation in React Native Gesture Handler and the other in React Native. So let's import the right component. Now here we need to set two props. The first one is value, which we set to a Boolean variable. So let's declare a Boolean variable here using the state hook. We give it an initial value of false. Now we get an array and destructure it. Let's call our state variable is new. And this function set is new. Okay. Now we bind the value prop to is new and then handle the onValue change event. We set this to a function. This function gets the new value, which is a Boolean. Now here we set our state variable. So pretty straightforward. Now let's take a look. So here's a switch on iOS. We can change it. Looks beautiful. And here's our switch on Android. As you see, the switch on Android appears on the right side of the screen. This is part of the design language of Android, which is different from the design language of iOS. So this is how we use the switch component. We basically set the value prop to a state variable and then handle the onValue change event to update our state variable. So we talked about text input and switch in React Native. These are the only input components available in the React Native core. Previously, we also used to have a picker component, but that's removed from the core, so we cannot find it here. We can find it in the search box. Let's search for picker. So as you can see, this component is deprecated. Now we have to use this library, React Native community/picker. Now, unfortunately, at the time of recording this video, this library is not part of Expo ecosystem, so we cannot use it in an Expo project. Because to install this, we need to have access to the native iOS project. Let me show you. So let's take a look at the documentation. Under installation instructions, look, we can install this using npm or yarn. That is pretty straightforward. But for iOS, we have an extra step and we cannot run this in an Expo project. Because when using Expo, we don't have access to the native iOS and Android projects. We only have JavaScript code. But that's not a big deal. We can always eject from Expo to get access to those native projects. We'll talk about that in the future. So we cannot use this React Native picker because it's not currently part of the Expo ecosystem. In contrast, we have this component in Expo. It's called datetime picker. With this, we can pick a datetime value. This is different from the picker component. With the picker component, we can select a value from a list of values. Now back to this datetime picker. Look, to install this, we have to type expo install React Native community/datetime picker. So this library is also built by the React Native community. It's not part of React Native core, but because it's supported in Expo, we can easily install it. Now, hopefully in the future, the picker component we talked about will also be available in Expo. But for the app that we've been working on, I'm going to show you how to build a custom picker component that has the same look across different platforms. So we don't really need to eject from Expo just for using a single third-party library. It's unnecessary. So next, I'm going to show you how to build a picker component from scratch.